On New Year's Eve, a reclusive millionaire received an unexpected call that shattered his solitude. "Hello, sir. You need to come to the hospital immediately. Your child has just been born." Carl Gregg froze, assuming it was some kind of cruel joke. But the nurse on the line continued, her tone calm yet insistent. "The mother's name is Rose Tams," she added, and suddenly the world tilted on its axis. Carl sat alone in his luxurious penthouse, perched high above the glittering cityscape. The untouched glass of scotch in his hand reflected the dim glow of the room, which was a shrine to wealth and taste, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and art worth more than most people's homes. Yet, for all its splendor, the silence around him was oppressive. It was New Year's Eve, but Carl had turned down every invitation, galas, private parties, exclusive gatherings. His assistant had been perplexed. "You need to be seen," she'd urged, half pleading, half chiding. Carl had simply shaken his head, offering a vague excuse about being busy. The truth was simpler. There was no one he genuinely wanted to celebrate with. The world admired him. A self-made millionaire by 35, the founder of a thriving tech empire. But tonight, as laughter and celebration echoed faintly from the streets below, all he felt was a hollow ache. The sleek clock on the wall read 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes until midnight, another year, another cycle of empty accomplishments. His phone buzzed on the glass table beside him. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Only a handful of people had that number, and their calls rarely brought good news. Yet the persistent vibration broke through the stillness, compelling him to answer. "Gregg," he said curtly, his voice heavy with weariness. "Mr. Gregg," a gentle but firm voice replied. "This is Nurse Beverly from St. Michael's Hospital. I'm sorry to disturb you, but this is an urgent matter." Carl straightened in his chair, confusion clouding his thoughts. "I think you have the wrong number." "No, sir," the nurse replied quickly. "We have a newborn here, and the mother listed you as the father. She passed away during childbirth." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice sharp and disbelieving. "I don't have a child. There must be some mistake." "I understand this is shocking, sir," the nurse said gently, though her tone carried a note of sympathy. "The mother named you in her final moments. We need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible." Carl's mind raced, searching for any logical explanation. "What's the mother's name?" "Rose Tams," the nurse said after a brief pause. The name landed like a stone in his stomach. Rose. He hadn't thought about her in years. They had dated briefly, a few fleeting months that had ended amicably, or so he'd believed. She was unlike anyone he'd met in his cutthroat world. Kind, creative, and warm in a way that had both intrigued and intimidated him. But at the time, he'd been too consumed by his ambition to let her in. This can't be right," he muttered, his voice thick with denial. "Rose and I haven't spoken in years. If this were true, she would have told me." "She didn't have much time," the nurse interjected softly. "She made it clear that you're the father, sir. We need you here. The baby needs you." Carl sank back into his chair, the room seeming to shift around him. A baby. His baby. The words felt unreal, impossible. How could he, of all people, be a father? Carl had spent his life avoiding attachments, fortifying himself behind walls no one could breach. Now, out of nowhere, he was being told he had a child. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he muttered, almost to himself. "I understand this is difficult to process," the nurse replied patiently. "But the child needs immediate care and a legal guardian. Please come to the hospital and bring identification. We'll explain everything when you arrive." Carl's grip tightened on the phone. His first instinct was to refuse, to dismiss this as a misunderstanding and retreat back to his meticulously constructed life. But something in the nurse's voice, the urgency, the quiet plea, stopped him. He thought of Rose, her gentle smile, the way she had looked at him as if she saw beyond the cold, calculating exterior he presented to the world. Could she really have carried his child all this time without telling him? "Fine," he said, the word laden with reluctance. "I'll be there." The nurse thanked him and hung up. Carl sat motionless for a moment, the once comforting silence of the room now oppressive. Setting the phone down, he rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the upheaval that had crashed into his carefully ordered life. Rising, he walked to the massive windows, gazing out at the city. Fireworks were already lighting up the night sky, their brilliant colors dancing against the darkness. He watched them in silence, their celebratory energy starkly contrasting the turmoil within him. After a moment, he turned away, grabbed his coat, and left. His sleek black car waited in the private garage below, but for once, the effortless luxury it symbolized offered no satisfaction. As he drove through the vibrant city streets alive with revelers, he felt an inexplicable pull, as though fate had chosen this very night to dismantle everything he thought he knew. When he arrived at the hospital parking lot, the weight of the situation fully settled on his shoulders. He had no idea what awaited him inside. An infant, a fragment of himself he never knew existed, and a new reality he wasn't sure he could face. For the first time in years, Carl felt something beyond emptiness. It was fear, yes, but also the faintest glimmer of something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. Inside the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant stung his senses. The quiet hum of machines and the muffled voices of staff were a stark contrast to the fireworks he had passed moments earlier. Standing beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, he felt the gravity of his situation pressing down on him. A nurse approached, her expression professional but laced with sympathy. "Mr. Gregg," she asked softly. Carl nodded, his throat dry. During the drive, he had convinced himself this was all a mix-up, a mistake. But the look in her eyes told him otherwise. "Follow me," she said, her voice calm but firm. She led him through a labyrinth of hallways until they reached a small, quiet office. Gesturing for him to sit, she handed him a sealed envelope. "This is from Rose," she said. "She asked that you receive it if something happened to her." Carl stared at the envelope, his name written in Rose's familiar handwriting. For a moment, he was paralyzed. His hands, steady in the boardroom and during high-stakes negotiations, trembled as he reached out to take it. The nurse gave him a moment of privacy, stepping quietly out of the room. Slipping out of the room with a promise to return shortly, Carl broke the seal on the envelope. Unfolding the letter, his breath caught as he recognized Rose's handwriting, thoughtful, heartfelt, and unflinchingly honest. "Dear Carl, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here. Writing those words feels surreal, but I knew I had to prepare for the possibility. There's so much I want to say, but I'll try to keep it simple. First, I want you to know that I didn't keep our child from you out of spite or secrecy. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you. I saw the weight you carried, the empire you were building, and the walls you surrounded yourself with. I thought giving you this news might only make things harder for you. But as I carried our daughter, I realized how wrong I was. I thought about you every day, Carl. I thought about how kind you could be when you let your guard down, how much passion you poured into the things you cared about, and how I saw glimpses of a man capable of deep love, even if you didn't see it yourself. Her name is Treasure. I chose it because it means play in some languages, and I want her to have a life filled with joy and laughter. But she also needs stability, love, and someone to guide her. That's why I named you. Because no matter how much I doubted myself, I never doubted you. Please take care of her, Carl. She's part of you, part of us, and I believe she'll be the best thing that ever happens to you. With love, always, Rose." Carl lowered the letter, his chest tight with emotion. He hadn't cried in years, decades perhaps, but now his vision blurred, and he had to steady himself against the table. Rose's words echoed in his mind, each one pulling him deeper into a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't untangle. The nurse returned, her presence grounding him. "Are you ready to meet her?" she asked gently. He hesitated but nodded, his legs feeling like lead as he followed her down the hallway. Each step brought him closer to a reality he wasn't sure he could handle. When they reached the neonatal unit, the nurse stopped in front of a large window. Inside, rows of tiny cribs lined the room, each one cradling a fragile new life. She pointed to a crib near the corner. "That's her," the nurse said. Carl stepped closer, his breath catching. There she was, a tiny bundle swaddled in pink. Her features were delicate and impossibly small. Dark curls framed her forehead, and her face wore an expression of peaceful oblivion. His first instinct was to step back, to retreat into the safety of denial. This couldn't be real. How could something so small, so vulnerable, possibly belong to him? But as he stood there, he felt an inexplicable pull, a magnetic connection that held him in place. Sensing his hesitation, the nurse spoke softly. "You can hold her if you'd like." His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. "I don't know how." "That's Tam's," she said with a reassuring smile. "I'll show you." Moments later, Carl found himself seated in a rocking chair as the nurse gently placed Treasure in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, yet in that moment, it felt as if the universe itself had shifted. One tiny hand peeked out from the blanket, her fingers curling reflexively. Carl hesitated before reaching out, and when her tiny hand closed around his finger, something inside him broke open. "She's perfect," he whispered, the words spilling out unbidden. The nurse smiled warmly. "She's been waiting for you." As he rocked her gently, Carl's thoughts drifted back to Rose's letter, to her unwavering belief in him. He wasn't ready for this. How could he be? His life had been a fortress of ambition and control. Yet here was Treasure, demanding nothing from him but the love he wasn't sure he knew how to give. He gazed down at her tiny, innocent features and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took his breath away. Rose had carried this secret, this immense responsibility alone. She had faced her fears without him, and now she was gone. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know." Treasure stirred slightly in his arms, her tiny lips parting in a soft yawn. The simple act brought an unexpected smile to his face. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel something beyond guilt and fear. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was something, a flicker of hope, just as Rose had written about. The nurse stepped forward, breaking the silence gently. "We'll need to go over some paperwork, but for now, just take your time with her." Carl nodded, his gaze fixed on Treasure. He didn't know how he was going to navigate this new reality, or what kind of father he could be. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away, not from her. Not now. Rose had seen something in him, a capacity for love and care he had long buried, and as he held Treasure, he began to wonder if she had been right all along. Carl sat in the hospital chair, Treasure cradled against his chest. The world outside was slowly brightening, the first rays of dawn casting a soft glow over the city. He hadn't moved in what felt like hours, unable to tear his eyes away from the fragile life resting in his arms. Everything about her was impossibly small, her tiny fingers, her delicate nose, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she slept. She looked so vulnerable, so new to the world, and unaware that her mother was gone. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him momentarily breathless. How could he possibly fill the void Rose had left behind? How could he ever be enough? Earlier, the nurse had quietly handed him a blank birth certificate form. He had stared at the empty space where her name should go, unable to bring himself to write anything. It felt too monumental, too final. Instead, he had clung to the letter Rose had written, her words echoing in his mind, a plea not just for Treasure's future but for his own. The weight of responsibility was immense. Yet, amid that burden, something else began to emerge, a strange, unexpected warmth. It hadn't been there during the chaotic phone call, or the shock of hearing Rose's name. But now, as Treasure shifted slightly in his arms, her tiny fingers brushing against his chest, he felt it. A connection. It was faint, like the first flicker of a flame, but it was there, steady and undeniable. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The nurse stepped in, her smile warm yet professional. "Mr. Gregg, would you like me to take her back to the nursery so you can get some rest?" Carl shook his head almost immediately, surprising even himself. "No, I'm fine," he said quickly. "I'd like to keep her with me a little longer." The nurse nodded, clearly accustomed to new parents reluctant to let their babies out of sight. "Take all the time you need," she said before stepping out again. Carl looked down at Treasure, who had stirred slightly at the sound of the door. Her tiny face scrunched for a moment before relaxing, her mouth forming a perfect little O. He couldn't help but smile, the tension in his chest easing just a fraction. "Treasure," he murmured, testing the name aloud. It felt right, playful and light, just as Rose had said, a promise of joy. But it needed something more. A connection to the woman who had brought her into the world and entrusted her to him. "Treasure Rose Gregg," he said softly, the words carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, holding her closer. "That's your name. Your Treasure Rose." The act of naming her felt transformative, like a distillation, a commitment, and a recognition. She wasn't just a baby in his arms, she was his daughter, his responsibility, and no amount of fear or self-doubt could change that. For the first time, Carl allowed himself to truly see her, taking in every detail, her tiny hands, the wisps of dark hair curling against her forehead, and the delicate curve of her cheek. She was so small, so utterly dependent on him, yet there was something powerful about her presence. She didn't know who he was, didn't care about his wealth or achievements. All she needed was someone to hold her and keep her safe. "I'm not sure I'm the right man for the job," he admitted quietly, his voice trembling. "But I'll try. I promise I'll try." Treasure stirred again, her tiny hand breaking free of the blanket. Her fingers curled and uncurled, and Carl hesitantly reached out, his much larger hand hovering above hers. When her fingers closed around his, gripping with surprising strength, he felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't a dramatic transformation or sudden epiphany, but a quiet, steady realization. She was his. And for the first time in his life, that thought terrified him more than anything else. He sat there a while longer, rocking her gently as the morning light filled the room. His thoughts drifted to Rose and the brief months they had spent together. She had been so different from anyone else he'd dated, kind, grounded, unafraid to challenge him. He had ended things because he couldn't see a place for her in his world, and now he wondered if that had been his greatest mistake. The door opened, admitting a different nurse with a clipboard. She smiled warmly as she took in the scene. "How's she doing?" she asked softly. "She's perfect," Carl replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The nurse nodded. "That's what we like to hear. I just need to go over a few things with you, paperwork, discharge procedures, things like that. Do you have someone you'd like to call? A partner or family member who can help?" The question caught him off guard. His mind immediately went to his assistant, his colleagues, the network of people who managed every aspect of his life. But none of them were family. None of them were Rose. "No," he said after a moment. "It's just me." The nurse didn't press, instead guiding him through the process with practiced efficiency. Carl listened, his mind only half absorbing the details. He kept one hand on Treasure's blanket the entire time, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. By the time they finished, the weight of the situation had fully settled on his shoulders. He had named her, held her, and promised her a life he wasn't sure he could provide. But there was no going back now. This was his reality, and for better or worse, he was determined to face it. As the nurse left, Carl looked down at Treasure once more. She had fallen asleep again, her tiny face peaceful and serene. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted softly, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'll figure it out. For you, I'll figure it out." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, the gesture awkward and unfamiliar, but filled with meaning. The flame of connection he had felt earlier was growing stronger, filling the empty spaces within him. "Treasure Rose Gregg," he said softly, the words carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, holding her closer. "That's your name. Your Treasure Rose." The act of naming her felt transformative, like a distillation, a commitment, and a recognition. She wasn't just a baby in his arms, she was his daughter, his responsibility, and no amount of fear or self-doubt could change that. For the first time, Carl allowed himself to truly see her, taking in every detail, her tiny hands, the wisps of dark hair curling against her forehead, and the delicate curve of her cheek. She was so small, so utterly dependent on him, yet there was something powerful about her presence. She didn't know who he was, didn't care about his wealth or achievements. All she needed was someone to hold her and keep her safe. "I'm not sure I'm the right man for the job," he admitted quietly, his voice trembling. "But I'll try. I promise I'll try." Treasure stirred again, her tiny hand breaking free of the blanket. Her fingers curled and uncurled, and Carl hesitantly reached out, his much larger hand hovering above hers. When her fingers closed around his, gripping with surprising strength, he felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't a dramatic transformation or sudden epiphany, but a quiet, steady realization. She was his. And for the first time in his life, that thought terrified him more than anything else. He sat there a while longer, rocking her gently as the morning light filled the room. His thoughts drifted to Rose and the brief months they had spent together. She had been so different from anyone else he'd dated, kind, grounded, unafraid to challenge him. He had ended things because he couldn't see a place for her in his world, and now he wondered if that had been his greatest mistake. The door opened, admitting a different nurse with a clipboard. She smiled warmly as she took in the scene. "How's she doing?" she asked softly. "She's perfect," Carl replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The nurse nodded. "That's what we like to hear. I just need to go over a few things with you, paperwork, discharge procedures, things like that. Do you have someone you'd like to call? A partner or family member who can help?" The question caught him off guard. His mind immediately went to his assistant, his colleagues, the network of people who managed every aspect of his life. But none of them were family. None of them were Rose. "No," he said after a moment. "It's just me." The nurse didn't press, instead guiding him through the process with practiced efficiency. Carl listened, his mind only half absorbing the details. He kept one hand on Treasure's blanket the entire time, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. By the time they finished, the weight of the situation had fully settled on his shoulders. He had named her, held her, and promised her a life he wasn't sure he could provide. But there was no going back now. This was his reality, and for better or worse, he was determined to face it. As the nurse left, Carl looked down at Treasure once more. She had fallen asleep again, her tiny face peaceful and serene. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted softly, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'll figure it out. For you, I'll figure it out." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, the gesture awkward and unfamiliar, but filled with meaning. The flame of connection he had felt earlier was growing stronger, filling the empty spaces within him. Treasure Rose Gregg wasn't just his daughter. She was his opportunity to become something more, to build a life that truly mattered. Carl stood in the nursery, gently rocking Treasure in his arms as the faint glow of a night light illuminated the room. The apartment, once stark and clinical, had undergone a transformation since he'd brought her home. The cold, impersonal lines of his penthouse were now softened by pastel accents, a crib by the window, shelves stacked with baby books, and a mobile slowly spinning in the dim light. Despite the changes, the sense of chaos was overwhelming. Nothing in Carl's meticulously ordered world had prepared him for the whirlwind of fatherhood. His days, once filled with meetings, emails, and strategic decisions, were now interrupted by cries, feedings, and diaper changes. The nights were even harder, leaving him sleepless and uncertain. He had thought hiring help would ease the transition. The nanny, an experienced woman named Mike, arrived within hours of his call. She was efficient and kind, immediately taking charge and teaching him the basics of caring for Treasure. But the more he watched her care for his daughter, the more he felt like an outsider, a bystander in his own child's life. Carl had always been good at delegating, trusting his team to execute his vision, but parenthood felt different. Treasure wasn't a project or a quarterly goal. She needed more than the structured systems and problem-solving strategies that had built his empire. She needed him. One evening, after Mike had gently suggested he take a break, Carl found himself sitting alone in his office, staring at an old photograph of his parents. His father's stern face loomed in his memory, a man who had rarely smiled and never offered a word of praise. Carl's childhood had been defined by cold expectations, where every interaction felt like a transaction rather than an expression of love. He had vowed never to be like his father, but now, holding Treasure's future in his hands, he feared he might repeat the same mistakes. What if he wasn't capable of giving her what she needed? What if his own brokenness seeped into her life, shaping her in ways he couldn't undo? Treasure's cry pierced the air, pulling him from his thoughts. He rushed to the nursery, his heart pounding. Mike wasn't scheduled to arrive until the morning, and the responsibility of calming her fell squarely on his shoulders. When he reached her crib, she was kicking her tiny legs, her face red and scrunched in distress. He scooped her up, his movements still awkward but improving with practice. Her cries didn't subside immediately, and a wave of panic surged through him. "It's Tams," he murmured, rocking her gently. "I've got you. I'll figure this out." Her wails softened, though tears still streaked her cheeks. Carl settled into the chair by the crib, holding her close and letting her tiny hand clutch his finger. The touch was grounding, a reminder that, despite his doubts, he was here. He was trying. The hours turned into days, and slowly Carl began to find a rhythm. He learned how to distinguish her cries, hunger, discomfort, exhaustion, and how to soothe her in ways that worked. Mike remained a steady presence, but Carl made a conscious effort to take the lead. He was there for the feedings, the sleepless nights, and the quiet moments when Treasure would gaze up at him with wide, curious eyes. Yet even as he adjusted, the doubts lingered. One evening, after finally getting Treasure to sleep, Carl sank onto the couch and let his head fall into his hands. The weight of it all pressed down on him. An endless tide of questions and fears swirled in his mind. Was he doing enough? Was he good enough? He thought of Rose's letter, her unwavering belief in his capacity to love and care for their daughter. She had seen something in him that he struggled to see in himself. But what if she had been wrong? What if he let Treasure down, the way his father had let him down? The sound of tiny coos pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Treasure stirring in her crib, her face peaceful as her little fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. So small, so innocent, yet she had already changed his world in ways he couldn't have imagined. Carl stood and walked over to her crib, gazing down at her. His thoughts drifted back to his father, to the long stretches of silence and the weight of expectations that had defined his childhood. He remembered the boy he had been, yearning for a kind word or a moment of connection that never came. "I won't do that to you," he whispered, his voice quiet but determined. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. You deserve better." He reached down and gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. The promise felt heavy, but it also felt right. Treasure deserved more than he had been given, and for her, he was willing to try. The weeks blurred by, full of firsts, first smiles, first attempts at holding her head up, and the first moments where Carl felt faint glimmers of confidence. Every gregstone, no matter how small, felt like a victory. But there were setbacks too, nights when nothing seemed to calm her, and days when the weight of his own inadequacies threatened to overwhelm him. Still, he pressed on. He started reading parenting books late into the night, seeking advice wherever he could find it. He reached out to an old friend, a father of 3, and listened as he shared his own struggles and triumphs. Bit by bit, Carl began to believe he could do this, that he could be the father Treasure needed. One afternoon, as Treasure napped in her crib, Carl stood in the living room, staring at a stack of work files on the table. It had been weeks since he had stepped into his office, delegating everything to his team while he focused on Treasure. The thought of returning to that world felt distant, almost foreign. For years, his work had defined him, filling the empty spaces inside him with purpose and accomplishment. But now, as he looked at the files, he realized something had shifted. Treasure had filled those spaces in a way that no achievement ever could. He turned away from the files and walked back to the nursery, sitting beside her crib. Watching her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, he realized she was his world now. She was his reason for trying, for believing he could be better. And for the first time, the weight of responsibility didn't feel so heavy, it felt like love. The days began to take on a rhythm, imperfect but comforting. As Carl settled into his new role as a father, there were moments of chaos. Nights when Treasure refused to sleep, mornings when he couldn't seem to stop her crying, but there were also moments of quiet triumph. He was learning, slowly but surely, how to care for her. He started to recognize the little cues that signaled her needs, the hungry cry, the sleepy whimper, the way her tiny fists curled when she was frustrated. With every successful feeding, every calm moment after a fit of tears, he felt a small spark of pride. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. One morning, as the soft light of dawn filtered through the nursery window, Carl sat with Treasure in his lap. She was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes, her tiny mouth forming an almost smile. Suddenly, she let out a soft gurgle, her face lighting up with something that could only be described as joy. It was her first real smile, and Carl's breath caught. He froze, unsure if he'd imagined it, but then she did it again, her lips curling in a way that made his chest ache. "You're smiling," he whispered, a grin spreading across his own face. "You're actually smiling." An overwhelming rush of emotion surged through him, a mixture of joy and disbelief. She was still so small, so new to the world, yet in that tiny smile, Carl saw the beginning of a bond he hadn't been sure he could form. He leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his heart swelling in a way he hadn't thought possible. Moments like these made the sleepless nights and constant self-doubt worth it. They gave him the strength to keep going, even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. But as he grew closer to Treasure, Carl couldn't ignore the growing divide between his new life and the one he had built before her. His company had been his entire world for years, a relentless pursuit of success that left little room for anything else. But now, as he watched Treasure's tiny gregstons, her first laugh, her fascination with the colorful mobile above her crib, he found himself questioning everything. What was the point of all his accomplishments if he couldn't be present for these moments? If he missed the chance to watch his daughter grow? It wasn't an easy decision, but Carl began to step back from his role as CEO. He delegated responsibilities to his most trusted colleagues, ensuring the company would continue to thrive in his absence. There were objections, of course, investors who questioned his priorities, board members who doubted his commitment, but Carl stood firm. For the first time in his life, work came second. Instead of 12-hour days in the office, he spent his mornings with Treasure, reading to her, feeding her, simply being with her. In the afternoons, he worked from home, carving out hours for calls and meetings while still keeping her close. It was a delicate balance, and there were times when it felt like he was failing at both, but he knew he was doing the right thing. Yet, even as he poured himself into fatherhood, there was a part of him that remained unresolved, a part that couldn't stop thinking about Rose. Her absence loomed over everything, a quiet reminder of the life they could have shared, the family they could have been. One crisp autumn afternoon, Carl decided it was time to face that lingering grief. He dressed Treasure warmly and drove to the cemetery where Rose was buried. The air was cool and still, the trees above casting long shadows across the ground. He carried Treasure in his arms as he approached the simple gravestone, its inscription a bittersweet reminder of the woman he had lost. For a long moment, he stood there in silence, unsure of what to say. The last time he had seen Rose, they had parted on good terms, but there had been no indication of what lay ahead, no way of knowing their paths would intersect again in this way. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. If I'd known, I would have been there." His throat tightened, and he looked down at Treasure, who was gazing up at him with her wide, innocent eyes. "She's beautiful, Rose," he said, his voice breaking. "She's perfect. You were right about her. About me." He sank down onto the grass, holding Treasure close as he spoke. He told Rose about the sleepless nights, the tiny triumphs, the way Treasure's smile had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Carl apologized for the years they had lost, for not being the man Rose had believed he could be sooner. "I promise I'll do right by her," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "I'll give her the life you wanted for her. I'll make sure she knows how much you loved her." The wind rustled gently through the trees, and for a moment, Carl felt a sense of peace. He couldn't change the past or undo the choices that had led them here, but he could honor Rose's memory by being the father Treasure deserved. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light across the cemetery, Carl stood and kissed his fingertips before pressing them to Rose's gravestone. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." He turned and walked back to the car, Treasure nestled against his chest. She had fallen asleep, her tiny hand clutching the fabric of his jacket. Carl looked down at her and smiled. The weight of grief still lingered, but it was no longer overwhelming. Driving home, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. This was his life now, messy and imperfect, but full of purpose. Treasure had given him something he hadn't even realized he was missing. A reason to believe in himself, a reason to keep going. As they reached the apartment, Carl carried her inside. He glanced around the space that had once felt so empty. It wasn't just his home anymore, it was Treasure's too. Together, they were building something new, something that mattered. For the first time in a long time, Carl felt whole. The quiet routine Carl had worked so hard to establish was shattered one morning when his phone buzzed incessantly on the kitchen counter. Treasure was strapped into her high chair, happily babbling as she squished pureed carrots between her fingers. Carl had just turned to grab a paper towel when the alert caught his eye. He unlocked the screen, his stomach dropping at the headline, "Millionaire Carl Gregg's Secret Baby. Who's the mother?" Below it was a grainy photo of him carrying Treasure in the park, her face partially hidden but unmistakably visible. A knot of dread coiled in his chest as he skimmed the article, which was riddled with speculation and invasive details about his private life. His first instinct was to shield Treasure, to protect her from the prying eyes of a world that would never understand what she meant to him. The media had always been a part of his life, a necessary evil he had learned to tolerate, but this felt different. This wasn't about him, it was about her, an innocent baby who deserved none of this scrutiny. Carl called his public relations team, his voice tight with anger as he instructed them to do everything in their power to mitigate the story. But even as they assured him they'd handle it, he knew there was only so much they could do. The story was out there, and the vultures would circle over the next few days. The press intrusion grew worse. Paparazzi camped outside his building, their cameras flashing every time he stepped out. He started taking Treasure to parks and activities in the early hours of the morning, hoping to avoid the crowds, but it was a temporary fix at best. He could see the questions in people's eyes, hear the murmurs as strangers whispered about him and his daughter. One evening, as he sat in the nursery rocking Treasure to sleep, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He looked at her peaceful face, her tiny hand resting against his chest, and felt a surge of protectiveness unlike anything he had ever known. "I'm not going to let them hurt you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't care what it costs me." The next day, Carl took a drastic step. He contacted his legal team to implement stronger privacy measures, ensuring that anyone who published photos of Treasure would face severe consequences. He also made the difficult decision to address the rumors directly, releasing a carefully worded statement about his commitment to his daughter and his desire for her to grow up away from the public eye. The backlash was immediate. Some accused him of hiding, while others praised his decision. But Carl didn't care. His only priority was Treasure, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. Still, the ordeal left him feeling isolated. For years, he had relied on his ability to compartmentalize and handle challenges on his own. But now, with Treasure's well-being at stake, he realized he couldn't do this alone. Reluctantly, he began to reach out to people he had distanced himself from. He called his college friend Marcus, who had 2 young kids of his own, and spent hours on the phone asking for advice about everything from sleep schedules to toddler tantrums. He also reconnected with his younger sister Stella, who had always been the more nurturing one in the family. She immediately offered to come visit, bringing a warmth and familiarity that Carl hadn't realized how much he missed. Stella arrived a few days later, arms full of gifts for Treasure. Her face lit up with excitement as soon as she saw her niece, melting as she scooped the baby into her arms and cooed at her with a joy that made Carl's heart ache. "She's perfect," Stella said softly as she rocked Treasure. "You're doing a good job. I can see it." Her words brought a lump to his throat. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them, or how much he had doubted himself despite all his efforts. With Stella's help, the apartment began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. She cooked meals, offered parenting tips, and spent hours playing with Treasure, giving Carl a chance to breathe. Her presence reminded him of what it meant to have a support system, something he had pushed away for so long in his pursuit of success. But even as he leaned on Stella and Marcus, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that there was more work to be done within himself. He had spent his entire life building walls, and while Treasure had managed to break through them, he knew those barriers still lingered, threatening to hold him back. One evening, after putting Treasure to bed, Carl made a decision. He sat down at his desk and searched for a therapist, someone who could help him untangle the mess of emotions he had buried for years. It wasn't an easy step. Admitting he needed help felt like a vulnerability he wasn't used to, but he knew it was necessary. The first session was awkward. Carl fumbled over his words, unsure of how to articulate what he was feeling. But as the sessions continued, he began to open up. He talked about his father, about the cold distance that had defined their relationship, and the fear that he might repeat those patterns with Treasure. He talked about Rose, the guilt and grief that still lingered despite his efforts to move forward. Through it all, the therapist listened, offering gentle guidance and helping him see the progress he was making, even if it felt slow. Each session felt like peeling back another layer, exposing wounds he had long ignored but was finally ready to heal. As the weeks passed, Carl noticed subtle changes in himself. He felt lighter, more present. The fear that had once paralyzed him began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence in his ability to be the father Treasure needed. As Carl sat in the living room with Treasure asleep in his arms, he reflected on how far they had come. The challenges hadn't disappeared. There were still sleepless nights, public scrutiny, and moments of doubt, but he no longer felt like he was facing them alone. He had Treasure, Stella, Marcus, and even a version of himself he was finally beginning to trust. Looking down at Treasure's peaceful face, he smiled. She had changed everything, breaking open a life he had thought was complete and filling it with something far richer. For the first time, he felt not just like a protector or provider, but like a father. In that, he found a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. Carl sat on the living room floor, surrounded by scattered blocks and stuffed animals, as Treasure let out a peal of laughter. Her tiny hands clapped together, and her face lit up with pure joy as she toppled a tower of colorful blocks he had painstakingly built just for her to destroy. He laughed too, unable to help himself. Her giggles were infectious, filling every corner of the once sterile penthouse. The transformation of his home mirrored the one happening in his heart. Gone were the austere minimalist furnishings and the cold, detached atmosphere. Now, the space was alive with color and warmth. Treasure's nursery was the crown jewel, a cozy sanctuary painted in soft pastels, filled with plush animals, books, and a crib adorned with a handmade mobile. Carl had spent hours assembling it himself, determined to make it perfect. The rest of the house had followed suit. Framed photos of Treasure adorned the walls, capturing her first smile, her first attempts at crawling, and moments of quiet connection between them. Toys and baby gear were scattered across the living room, and a soft rug replaced the hard marble floor to give Treasure a safe place to play. It was messy, chaotic, and utterly unlike the life Carl had once lived, but he wouldn't have it any other way. As Treasure crawled toward him, babbling in her own language, Carl scooped her up and planted a kiss on her chubby cheek. She squealed in delight, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. These moments were everything. They made the sleepless nights, the constant juggling of work and parenting, and the lingering challenges worth it. A few months later, Carl decided to mark a gravestone of his own. For years, he had avoided celebrating his birthday, dismissing it as just another day. But now, with Treasure in his life, he felt differently. She had given him a reason to celebrate, a reminder that life was worth cherishing. He planned a small gathering, inviting Stella, Marcus, and a handful of close friends who had become a part of Treasure's world. The night of the party, the penthouse was filled with the hum of conversation and the sound of laughter. Carl had transformed the dining area into a cozy, inviting space with fairy lights strung across the windows and a table set with simple, thoughtful touches. Treasure, dressed in an adorable floral dress that Stella had picked out, was the center of attention. She toddled between guests, her steps wobbly but determined, and charmed everyone with her curious gaze and toothy smiles. Carl watched her with a sense of pride and wonder, still amazed by how much she had changed his life. As the evening wore on, Stella raised a toast to Carl. Her voice was warm and affectionate as she said, "For finding joy in the unexpected, for embracing fatherhood with a full heart, and for showing us all that second chances can lead to the most beautiful things." Carl felt his chest tighten, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He glanced at Treasure, who was busy trying to grab a handful of cake from his plate, and smiled. "To Treasure," he said, raising his glass, "for teaching me what it means to truly live." The room erupted in cheers, and for the first time in years, Carl felt a sense of belonging. This wasn't just his home anymore. It was a place filled with love, laughter, and the people who mattered most. In the weeks that followed, Carl found himself thinking about Rose more often. Her absence was still a quiet ache, but it no longer felt like an open wound. Instead, it was a gentle reminder of the life they could have shared and the promise he had made to honor her memory. Inspired by her letter and the love she had for Treasure, Carl began to envision a way to give back. He remembered how strong and independent Rose had been, how she had faced pregnancy and motherhood alone, and how many others might be in similar situations without the support they needed. That thought grew into an idea, and the idea became a plan. Carl decided to create a foundation in Rose's name, one dedicated to supporting single parents and children in need. The foundation would provide financial assistance, child care resources, and access to education and job training, everything Rose might have wanted for herself and Treasure. Launching the foundation was a labor of love. Carl poured himself into the work, meeting with experts, assembling a team, and personally funding the initial programs. For the first time, his wealth felt like more than just a number. It was a tool to create real, meaningful change. At the official launch event, Carl stood on stage with Treasure in his arms. The audience, a mix of colleagues, partners, and beneficiaries of the foundation, looked on with anticipation and gratitude. Carl took a deep breath, his heart pounding, and began to speak. "This foundation is more than just a name," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's a promise to honor someone who believed in love and resilience, even in the face of challenges. Rose Tams was the kind of person who inspired hope. And it's my privilege to carry that hope forward through this work." He glanced down at Treasure, who was playing with the microphone cord, oblivious to the significance of the moment. "And it's for her," he continued, his voice softening. "For my daughter, Treasure, who has shown me the importance of family, of connection, and of creating a world where every child has the chance to thrive." The room erupted in applause, and Carl felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over him. This wasn't just a tribute to Rose or a gift for Treasure. It was a new chapter in his life, one that reflected the man he was becoming. As the event wound down and Carl mingled with the attendees, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. He wasn't just building a better life for Treasure, he was building a legacy, one rooted in love, compassion, and second chances. That night, as he tucked Treasure into bed, Carl sat beside her crib and whispered a quiet promise. "We're building something beautiful, Treasure. For you, for your mom, and for everyone who needs a little hope. Thank you for showing me the way." Treasure stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand reaching out as if to grasp the words he had spoken. Carl smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. The snow fell gently outside the windows, blanketing the city in a pristine glow. Carl stood in the living room of his transformed penthouse. With a steaming mug of cocoa in his hand, Carl sat quietly, watching Treasure nearby on the plush rug as she focused intently on stacking blocks. Her little voice filled the room with a melody of innocence and wonder, and she babbled to herself as she played. It was New Year's Eve, exactly 1 year since his life had been irrevocably changed by a phone call that shattered his carefully constructed world. Carl exhaled softly, gazing at the city lights below through the condensation on the window. A year ago, this same view had felt cold and isolating, the height of his success doing little to fill the void in his heart. Now the same view felt alive, a backdrop to the warmth and joy that Treasure had brought into his life. He set his mug down and joined her on the floor, sitting cross-legged as she turned to him with a wide grin. Her tiny hand reached out, offering him one of the blocks. "Duh!" she exclaimed triumphantly. Carl's heart swelled. The first time she had called him duh, he had barely held back tears. It was such a simple word, but it carried a meaning so profound that he couldn't help but marvel at how much she had changed him. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, taking the block and adding it to her growing tower. She giggled and knocked it over in delight, the sound filling him with a happiness he hadn't known he could feel. As the clock inched closer to midnight, Stella arrived with a bottle of sparkling cider and a plate of homemade cookies. She greeted Treasure with her usual exuberance, scooping her up and twirling her around, much to the toddler's delight. Marcus arrived soon after, his 2 kids in tow, and the penthouse came alive with laughter, chatter, and a happy chaos of family. Carl watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't just a home, it was a haven, a place where love and connection thrived. He had spent so many years chasing success, building an empire, and yet it was in these small, messy moments that he had found his true purpose. As the countdown to midnight began, everyone gathered in the living room. Stella handed Treasure back to Carl, and he held her close, her small body warm against his chest. She was getting bigger now, her chubby legs strong and determined as she practiced walking with increasing confidence. 5, 4, 3, the group chanted, the excitement building. Just as they reached 1, Treasure squirmed in his arms. Her eyes were bright with determination as she wriggled free and took a wobbly step forward, then another. Carl froze, his breath caught in his throat as he watched her take her first unassisted steps. "She's walking!" Stella exclaimed, clapping her hands in delight. Carl's heart felt like it might burst. He crouched down, arms outstretched, and Treasure toddled toward him. Her movements were uncertain, but filled with the kind of courage that only a child could possess. When she finally fell into his arms, he held her tight, his chest tightening with emotion. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with pride. "You're amazing, Treasure." The fireworks outside erupted into a kaleidoscope of color, their vibrant explosions lighting up the night sky. Carl turned toward the window, still holding Treasure. Together, they watched the dazzling display. She clapped her hands in wonder, her face alight with pure joy. In that moment, Carl felt a quiet stillness settle over him. The past year had been one of transformation, filled with challenges, growth, and moments that had tested him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Yet, standing there with Treasure in his arms, he realized that every struggle, every doubt, and every tear had been worth it. "You changed everything, you know that?" he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "A year ago, I didn't even know what I was missing, and now I can't imagine life without you." She turned to him with a gummy smile, as if she understood every word. Carl chuckled, his heart so full it felt like it might overflow. Stella came up beside him, her eyes soft as she looked at the two of them. "You're a great dad, Carl," she said quietly. "Rose would be so proud." Carl nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He still thought about Rose often, especially during moments like this, when her absence was felt as strongly as her presence in Treasure's smile or the shape of her little hands. But instead of sadness, there was now a sense of gratitude, a deep appreciation for the gift she had given him, the love she had entrusted him with. As the fireworks continued to light up the sky, Carl held Treasure close and whispered promises he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "I'll always protect you," he said softly. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what." The noise of the party swirled around him, but for Carl, time seemed to slow. He gazed out at the city, the reflections of the fireworks shimmering in the glass, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was his life now, messy, unpredictable, and filled with more love than he had ever thought possible. Treasure had shown him the beauty of second chances, the power of connection, and the importance of finding joy in the unexpected. As the final fireworks burst in a dazzling display of light, Carl looked at Treasure, her tiny face filled with wonder, and smiled. He had found his purpose, his reason for being, and it had been right here all along, waiting for him to see it. Life's greatest treasures, he realized, often come from the most unexpected places. In the span of a single year, he had gone from a man consumed by ambition and loneliness to a father transformed by love, purpose, and hope. Through the challenges and triumphs, Carl discovered that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or success. It's found in the bonds we share, the lives we touch, and the moments we cherish. So, have you ever experienced an unexpected moment that completely shifted your perspective on life? We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and here's to finding joy in the unexpected. See you in the next video.